writing about the visit of the American president, or we might say the Irish American president, in 1963 for a British audience. The poet Louis MacNeice said that in this country, which is not without a record of violence, nobody has ever seen such a display of security. Queen Victoria must have been turning in her grave with envy. Now, the Kennedy visit, of course, was a great success in that it did what it was supposed to do for both political machines. And curiously, at a time when the eyes of the international press were very much on Kennedy in Ireland, the US Embassy, as we know it, and we'll get to that later on, was not yet open for business. The US Embassy in Ballsbridge is an instantly recallable building. It looks nothing like anything around it. It looks nothing like any other embassy in embassy land in Ireland for reasons that my guest explains today. And there's a logic. If you've ever wondered why are most embassies in Dublin found in historic Georgian or Victorian houses, there's a reason for that we'll get into. But instead, this very modernist structure says a lot about the style and advances architecturally of its own time and the message that it was trying to convey. And the entire precast structure, we read, was fabricated in the Netherlands, flat packed in a barge and shipped to Dublin in what was a challenging logistical and operational procedure. But the building internally and externally was supposed to evoke something about both places, Ireland and America. Cormac Murray is the author of a new gorgeous publication, America at Home, The Architecture and Politics of the US Embassy in Dublin. That title, I didn't quite get it at first, but he'll get into why it's called America at Home, and it's a great title. And while Cormac writes primarily about 20th century architecture, the scope in this beautiful publication is kind of widened out to the cultural and political contexts of the 1950s and the 1960s. The building makes a lot more sense when you understand the time in which it happened. I suppose the futurism of it, the space race, geopolitics, America's image of Ireland, Ireland's image of America, it's all there. The book is packed with archival images, many never printed before, and produced by Phibsboro Press, a small press that are interested in the built landscape. They've gone on quite the journey, actually, because their first publication was about the Phibsboro Shopping Centre. So from the Phibsboro Shopping Centre to the American Embassy. But I'll put the link to this new one in the show description. The building, as I'll get into today, can evoke strong memories for people. It's been a site of protest, in particular, the aftermath of the invasion of Iraq. I was also reminded of other things, standing outside it, holding my dad's hand on the Friday after 9/11. He and many other Dublin firefighters were there to honour their dead friends. And I went onto the RTE archive, where a report tells us at 3 p.m, the pipe band of the Dublin Fire Brigade led 250 firefighters to the gates of the embassy to lay floral wreaths in tribute to their colleagues in New York. For other people, it recalled memories of migration. It was the first stop, you hoped, on a new journey to America. It could be a place of disappointment if they said no. But it's a space that has changed massively. I was unaware, for example, that it was once a very open space, inside and out, a beautiful plaza, and a building that had a cultural mission, really, that intended for it to be a place of cultural exchange and for the public to be familiar with. When it opened, the building was accessible to the public on its first day. 5,000 people went to visit its interior, which is just unimaginable in our world today. Some stories of open days are legendary. When a tiny fragment of moon rock was put on display there in 1970, again, thousands of us showed up in just a few hours to have a look at it. The tiny fragment was described by one journalist as being about 1.5 inches in diameter, roughly the size of a walnut. But still, it had the feeling of a great occasion about it. It was a really nice time to be looking at this subject. I was recently in Japan, in Osaka, of all places, at the Expo 2025. I went over with the Bram Stoker festival team to what was called the Ireland Pavilion. And it was this kind of Irish timber and Japanese material making the form of a kind of abstract Celtic spiral. This was a kind of World's Fair where various nations were putting themselves, I suppose, on show. And it was curious to see how much, or sometimes how little, thought nations put into those pavilions. But those structures in Osaka, they were temporary. but nonetheless, they were collaborations between, national architectural agencies and artists. And in a way, they were a kind of embassy at that curious World's Fair where 250,000 people a day pass through. So, nations project images of themselves abroad, and embassies are very much part of that story. Thanks so much to Cormac Murray for joining me. Thanks to all of you who voted for the Dublin Pub, Social and Cultural History at the Irish Book Awards. It wasn't our day, Akshin, Maravinche, and I hope you are enjoying the book. There's lots of episodes coming up in quick succession. Walking around the Oliver Bond flats with Owen O'Brien, his new book on Herbert Sims, Charles Dickens in Dublin, and much more besides. But for now, enjoy the story of the American Embassy. When someone goes off and writes something, I always have the same first question. Why would you do that? What drew you to the subject of the American Embassy? And for Cormac, the unique nature of the building in terms of its design and construction was one thing, but also its setting.
I think it's just such a striking building in the context of Dublin. It's on a very prominent corner in Ballsbridge. I think most people who spend time in the city would recognize it. So from the very moment you see it, they think there's something very different about it. It's circular, it's in exposed concrete, and the concrete itself is kind of very intricate, contorted fins twisting together. I think I found that very captivating almost as soon as I started to study architecture, and I wanted to know about it. And then when I had an education in architecture, I learned that, there was an American architect who designed this, and it was sort of transplanted as an embassy building in Ballsbridge. So the story behind the building actually was as interesting as its visual identity as well.
Buildings are always, of course, an insight into their architect. Shane O'Toole, in a lovely personal reflective piece for Cormac's publication, remembers going to meet the man who was responsible for the US Embassy in Dublin. He was, Shane writes, an old man, almost alone, when I called by the tall, brown, dusty office off Union Square, full of slanting, greenish light, busting through the shades of other days. Old New York. He still came down from upstate into the city by train once a week. But Shane discovered that the architect had little interest in talking about the American Embassy in Dublin. He was always looking forwards.
Absolutely, yeah. I think he was a bit of a maverick. I would say he was probably a little bit ahead of his time in that he was kind of trying out all these different technologies, experimental types of architecture that were less established in the 50s, 60s, and 70s when he was active. I've heard some people describe him as well as a bit like the fifth Beatle, in that he was kind of surrounded by a lot of really successful, famous architects who would be sort of household names. People like Philip Johnson, Marcel Breuer, Walter Gropius, founder of the Bauhaus. But he never really was interested in international acclaim or fame. He was very passionate about what he did. And I suppose this building in itself, almost by the time he had finished it, he moved on and did stuff that was totally different. So, you can kind of get the sense of a restless creative spirit, in his work.
The US Embassy, we'll get into the long and winding road that led to it, opened in 1964. And I wanted to know from Cormac what it was like culturally in the era, a photograph of John Fitzgerald Kennedy hanging in many Irish homes. This was trying to communicate a message, this building, of something welcoming and cultural.
There's a few things there. I think the fact that the embassy actually opened in May of 1964. So it was right when RTE was becoming established in Ireland. So they actually filmed a kind of open documentary about the embassy, and all of a sudden people across the country were actually getting to familiar with this new exciting building. And I think the title of the book is America at Home, which comes from the phrase that my grandmother would have used about, a sense of luxury or glamour that you associate with America. And that was very much of the time. People did actually, associate America with a better life, the American dream, things like this, emigration. Very different, I suppose, and times have changed, that we don't always keep that association. But it was definitely intended to be a welcoming. That was part of the whole program of embassies at the time, was that they were to be welcoming to these societies and the cities that they were integrated into, as opposed to just functional or, defensive. So it was jointly an embassy and also kind of like a cultural center. They had the United States Information Service actually was co-occupying the building when it first opened, and they'd have art exhibitions, soirees. There was a bar there. I mean, I've talked to people who said the first time they saw the movie E.T. was in the atrium of this building. They even designed it to have two entrances, one for the functional embassy and one for the USIS, as they called it. So it was this place where you could actually go and get a taste of American life and culture, you know?
Core to that vision was its plaza, which feels lost now with the security culture around the building. It's not entirely surprising, is it, that the American embassy in time ended up feeling contained, fortressed. And by the time of even Nixon's visit to Ireland after Kennedy, there were some protests. Eggs hit the motorcade on Lord Edward Street as he journeyed through Dublin. RTE reported protesters marched down O'Connell Street through Dublin City and onto the embassy building in Ballsbridge, where they staged a peaceful sit-down protest. Those taking part sang "We Shall Overcome," a song synonymous with the African American civil rights movement and adopted by many of the civil rights protesters in Northern Ireland. And of course, Latin America and the suppression of church voices like Oscar Romero there ensured a uniquely Irish situation of kind of demonstrating priests and nuns at the embassy gates on occasion too. But Cormac makes the important point that all of this new, what would have been unimaginable in the days of Kennedy, protest and the like, this transformed the external feeling of the site significantly.
One of the big things about the building as well, on the same point, is that it was intended as a building with a plaza in front of it. And the plaza was described by the architect and by the embassy officials at the time as a gift to the people of Dublin. This sort of new landscape garden where, they had benches around the trees and you could sit out, enjoy, and look at this building, even if you weren't actually inside it. It's a circular building with a moat around it as well, a 9-foot moat. And what's really interesting is reading accounts of when it opened. They almost thought the moat was as much security as they'd ever need. Really, you could almost jump it now, but like at the time, they're like, oh yeah, it's imitating a fortification, a castle, like a Martella Tower or something, and it has a moat for security purposes. So I think, yeah, definitely when it was more accessible, even to stand around the building, it would have had a different atmosphere as well, completely. And they actually very nearly did put up railings in the 11th hour when the building was opening, but they actually, pushed back and that said, no, it'd be the wrong thing to do. Now I think they've no option but to put up the railings around it, to kind of keep out cars and protesters and everything. So it's very different.
In contextualizing the embassy, Cormac writes that the building began to symbolize the promise of America. This was very much by design. And when we look at a building like this and we're trying to find Ireland, and how a building like this is designed or the little motifs and the like that make a building, actually, when you look closer, plenty about America and its image of itself is there as well. At the time, embassies were important conveyors of political messages. The Soviet Union, which enjoyed an atrocious diplomatic relationship with Ireland, a country it regarded with very deep suspicion, was seeking its own expansion of influence, building embassies in what it regarded as the anti-colonial world. But this American embassy in Dublin wanted to speak to us about America and not just Ireland.
I've heard it described that this was one of a series of embassies in the late 1950s and 60s, which were a program at that time, which were kind of intended to contrast with Soviet embassies and buildings that they were welcoming, and generous and also advanced and modern. So they were getting leading architects to design them. But every single aspect of the building then was supposed to promote this idea of America as this hopeful, advanced place, So everything down to the door handles on some of these embassies were designed to be really high end and kind of carry through a motif as well. So someone described that you actually spend a lot of time in these buildings due to the nature of bureaucracy and administration, and there's waiting rooms and all this. So I suppose it's a building that's meant to be sort of lingered in and not one that you kind of pass through like a train station. And there's some fantastic imagery of people actually signing up for visas in the 70s and 80s, that you had this really modern building and then you had posters on the wall that said USA with pictures of cowboys on it. You know what I mean? So again, it's that kind of dual imagery, which is really interesting.
But what's clear about the American embassy is that this was designed to portray a message of modernity, both ways. And it said something of how America viewed us. I mean, you'd only build something like this in a country you regarded as quite modern. I put it to Cormac that it reminds me of the fact Sean Lemass, had appeared on the front of Time magazine around that moment. The nation's new mood is that of Sean Lamass, who 4 years ago succeeded Eamon de Valera as Taoiseach. Though Lamass has been de Valera's protege and heir apparent for 3 decades, the two men could not be more dissimilar. Dev, the aloof, magnetic revolutionary with a martyr's face and a mystic's mind, was the sort of leader who the Irish had adored in every age. Sean Lamass, a reticent, pragmatic planner called a quiet man, is by temperament and ancestry more Gallic than Gaelic, and represents a wholly new species of leadership for Ireland. In De Valera's shadow, their new Taoiseach has laboured single-mindedly for decades to break the vicious circle of declining living standards and dwindling population that threatened Ireland's very survival as a nation. In other words, this was no longer De Valera's Ireland. This was the Ireland of Sean Lamass. But even when you look at that Time magazine cover, it shows a factory and it shows industry and chimneys, but it still has a leprechaun.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's always that kind of it's two-sided, I suppose, in that America was treating us as a serious emerging nation where, there was a lot of business and economy that was valuable to them here, and totally changed the course of 20th century Ireland, but at the same time, there's that association with the old country and, the kind of leprechauns and things like this, that there was this sort of twee imagery so it was kind of two things at once, which I find really fascinating, and yeah, certainly you see that it's perfect. Like Sean Lamass has been honoured by on the front of Time magazine, and at the same time they have a leprechaun beside him. Might undermine it a bit.
So by now we've called this building the American Embassy several dozen times. And I don't feel bad because Cormac calls it the US Embassy on the front of his book. I put it to him that other embassies feel nothing like it. The Mexican Embassy, for example, has a plaque on it to Patrick Kavanagh. Why? Because once upon a time he lived there in digs. And it's not unusual, actually, that most of our embassies in Dublin are in buildings like that, red bricks in the fringes of the South City. Why is that?
You're reminding me of something that I always forget to say, which I should almost begin talking about this, is that it's not the embassy. It's everyone calls it the US Embassy, but it's actually the Chancery of the US Embassy in Dublin. Deerfield House is the official residence of the ambassador in Phoenix Park. It's a beautiful building. And I suppose the distinction of what makes an embassy versus a chancery is an embassy has the ambassador's residence, so their sleeping quarters. So it makes a lot of sense that, most embassies in Dublin actually are houses that are reoccupied if there are living quarters within them, and some of the more stately grand ones then it becomes part of, the image of that nation in Dublin. So this, as a chancery, I suppose, is slightly different in that sense. Interesting enough, their embassy used to be off Marion Square. I believe it was Marion Street. I'd have to double check that, but they actually wanted to move out to Ballsbridge, and they felt like the condition of the Georgian building at the time in the 1950s was actually deteriorating too much, that they wanted to be relocated to Ballsbridge, and it caused other controversies at the time. But it's very interesting now to think that they saw moving out to the suburbs as being an upgrade to actually being right in the centre of things.
But halfway through chatting, I was conscious that most people have probably never stepped inside of this building. So I asked Cormac, can you give me a sense of what the American Embassy feels like when you walk inside of it? And he captures something very important about it. Anyone who's been there will get this immediately. It almost feels like a building within a building.
So if you think of the building as a cylinder, on the inside, there's a 3-story atrium, which is another cylinder. And the remarkable thing is everything you see on the outside, so these twisted concrete fins, as we call them, some people describe them like whale jawbones, all these sort of descriptions, or a common one I hear a lot is the Aran sweater. That exact same structure is on the inside. And it means that actually the weight of the building is all taken by the outer facade and the inner atrium as well. And it's this kind of beautiful space. I mean, it'd be similar to like standing in City Hall, like, a circular space where they can have gatherings. But it is quite noisy, the acoustics in there. It's like there's a lot of hard surfaces. Do you know what I mean? And what's fascinating is some of the drawings that John M. Johansen did he kind of shows figures standing in what he called the arcade, looking into this central space. And Shane O'Toole and others have described it as figures shifting in the background, in the shadows, that there's this sense of when you're in there, you're actually not quite sure if you're being looked at and who's looking at you, because there's so many sort of hiding spaces. So it's really, really a fascinating space to be in, and it's great for events, and it has beautiful natural lighting at the top. So it's really fabulous space.
The building was clearly a massive headache for its architect. This project went back to 1956. Various incarnations of it were just completely shot down. Ridiculous things were said about not only the proposals for the building, but the area. I mean, on one occasion, Ballsbridge was described by an American politician as something of a slum. And I know he's about to say the line, but it's a good enough line to say twice. Representative Wayne Hayes would insist that the thing looks as much a Celtic tower as I do a jet aeroplane. Another called one design a series of flapjacks with a pat of butter on top. And to the defence of that politician, he went on to say, well, who am I to criticise? I don't classify myself as a qualified critic of either modern art or modern architecture. But Cormac pinpoints the election of John Fitzgerald Kennedy as a real turning point in this story. Things finally began to move at pace. And that's not too surprising, is it? I mean, every American president has their own focus in terms of where they want to direct their time and their influence. Grant Stockdale, appointed the ambassador to Ireland by Kennedy, emphasised to him the need to just get this thing moving, that the premises they were in at Merrion Square wasn't good enough. And Kennedy was aware that when they eventually landed on a design from Johansen, not everyone was going to like it. I mean, he wrote to Wayne Hayes and said, while I agree that the design will not please all tastes, the delay and expense involved in redesigning the building indicates that we should go ahead with the present design. In other words, this has gone on long enough. Please step aside.
Yes, I suppose like what's key is that the embassy design process started in 1956, and that was very difficult for the architect John M. Johansen. He had to kind of get approval by committee. It took 2 years and at least 7 iterations of the building before he got it approved by these like leading architects appointed by the state. Then it became a political issue, that Congress said that the building might actually destroy Irish-American relations. And there's some fantastic lines from Senator Wayne Hayes described it like as a modernistic mausoleum, and it looks as much like a Celtic tower as I do a jet airplane, was his line. So it became a source of controversy. But it was Kennedy's arrival in the White House. Obviously, then the Irish agenda came to the fore. He appointed Grant Stockdale as the ambassador to Ireland, a friend of his, who actually wrote to him directly saying this, embassy has to be addressed urgently. And as soon as Kennedy wrote to the senators that were objecting to this, they relented instantly. They just wanted to get the recognition, I suppose, that the president would actually see their views as important enough to write to them. So it was really, if not for Kennedy, who knows, it might never have happened.
But Johansen didn't necessarily get what he wanted, but he eventually settled on something that, consciously or otherwise, had interesting kind of undertones to it. Surveillance is something Cormac talks about immediately. And Cormac notes that not unlike the Soviets elsewhere, the Americans wanted to adopt local symbolism into buildings wherever they could.
Very fascinating to look at the archives of John M. Johansen and see all the different iterations. He started off with a square building. And then he was looking at hexagons, and he was really reluctant to give that up. And eventually he came to this circular form, which his line was, it turns its back on no one. And he meant that in a welcoming sense. But I think it's fascinating to think in the context of surveillance, obviously, that it's always looking at you. But the other embassies of that period, what they were actually tasked with doing was reflecting the kind of culture, the built heritage of the cities and the countries that they were in. So in Athens, for example, there's a chancery by Walter Gropius, who was the founder of the Bauhaus movement, and that was inspired by the Parthenon. There's a embassy in New Delhi by Edward Durrell Stone, which took inspiration from the Taj Mahal. So all of these embassies, I suppose, were you could argue to how meaningful it is. Like were they actually just doing kind of imitation? But they all had to take on something about their surroundings, which was new for modern architecture. Up to that point in the 20th century, modern architecture was functional. It was machine driven. You wouldn't do something for the sake of decoration. It had to, or ornament. Like it actually had to have a functional purpose. So this was a slight departure from that. And the embassy, this program was short lived. It was really in the 50s, and then John M. Johansen's one in Dublin was one of the last ones. But he argued that, of course, it imitated Celtic towers. Book of Kells was an example given, and then a whole suite of other things have been added onto that list now.
And perhaps what we got in the end, that circular building, was what suited that corner best. For a precast external building, one key problem was avoid it. The prehistory of the site was kind of interesting too. This was something very different from what was there before.
I think it's very interesting to actually look at the historic maps and kind of see there was like a Victorian house on that site. So the corner sites are always a little bit tricky in terms of how do you actually address two roads coming together at an acute angle, a triangular shaped site, and that's what the architect really struggled with in his early designs, is that like if he made it square, there would have to be a front entrance pointing in one direction, there'd have to be a rear. When he made it circular, it meant that it kind of faced in all directions, and it was the perfect. Another critic describes as Bauhaus reductivism, this triangle with a circle in it. That's Raymond Ryan. Said that. So I think the form was really interesting, but also on the technical side, it's really interesting because if you look at any of these, what we call precast concrete, so it's concrete that's fabricated in a factory and brought to the site, they always struggle with the corner, the junction of the corner. When you have the same panel kind of going around in a grid on two sides and then on a rectangular building, getting to the corner, that's always a very tricky detail. With this one, because it's circular, the exact same panel can go all the way around 360 degrees without ever meeting a corner. So it was really ingenious design in that sense.
It got over the line. The Irish Times compared Johansen's demeanour at the unveiling of the building to a nervous father seeing his child born. And it's not every day someone says something like Frank Aiken did, noting that the building would be slightly controversial, but that when an architect, quote, like a politician, ceases to be controversial, he would be better going off to die. So what is the architectural legacy of Johansen? I mean, at the time of his death in 2012, the New York Times described the 96-year-old as a celebrated modernist architect and the last surviving member of the Harvard Five. All with connections to Harvard's architectural school, they said. They dotted southwestern Connecticut with houses conveying the optimism of the time. Hugely influential in their field, the buildings were seen in museum exhibitions and on the covers of Life and Look magazines. The obituary didn't mention Ireland at all.
It's quickly disappearing, I think. He's, as in, there's a lot of records of it, but like, for example, the Morris Mechanic Theatre in Baltimore has been demolished. He also had a really famous Mummers Theatre in Oklahoma, which has also been demolished. But he has some large projects like Goddard Library in Clark University is still standing, so he would have done that. And there are some large scale projects. I think later in his career, he really was doing a lot of paper projects, stuff that actually never was likely to be built, stuff like using magnets and electricity and kinetic architecture, so he actually has a lot that's just on paper. But in terms of, it only adds to the significance, I suppose, of the US Embassy in Dublin, in that, like, he was a very important architect, very important in terms of theory as well. And the fact that a lot of his private houses, a lot of his other buildings have been demolished means that we have to do everything we can to keep something like this building,
And what should be done with this building? It's always interesting to ask anyone who's looking at the past of a site what they think could be done with it in future. I mean, there is an interesting cultural history to the site, isn't there? There was a time when people were in and out of it. Could that be the best future use for this building?
And this is it. There's been a lot of different calls, various people writing into the papers, saying it should be the home of the Arts Council, an Irish American museum. I think my main wish for the building is that let's get people back in there again. You know what I mean? Get it a public space, a civic space. To actually, if we get the plaza back, if the embassy, when and if the embassy vacate, I suppose there won't be the security issue, so we can have people wander in again. And something that respects the history of the building, is the most important thing. So I think that would lend itself to something like a museum or cultural use, but it could be anything really. Some of these embassies have been converted now into offices and hotels, and really, I suppose, if it was something like a hotel, it'd be a pity because not everyone can experience it then,
And for future plans, I put it to Cormac, would you be interested in looking at Irish embassies abroad? I think about the beautiful chiselled lettering Oscuelga on our embassy in London's Belgravia. You know, that might not mean much in the streets of Dublin, but there's a strong sense of importance where it is. You walk in the London embassy and you see Colin Davidson's painting of Edna O'Brien on the wall. Some of our embassies, Paris comes to mind, are within beautiful buildings that long predate an Irish nation on the world stage. But would it be interesting to go and look at Irish embassies across the world?
That might be the next book, is to start to look at. I'm interested in, I suppose, any type of building that assimilates a national identity and kind of projects an image of national identity that we can kind of look back on, that history is past now, and kind of question as to whether it was successful, and also how it's been passed on from one generation to another is quite interesting. So I wouldn't actually be that familiar with many Irish embassies. Luckily, I haven't had to spend too much time in them when traveling, but I definitely think it's something that I would like to understand, because I mean, I write a lot about modern Irish architecture, and part of the reason I find that period of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s so interesting in Ireland is that we were an emerging nation, and we were trying to get this modern architecture that reflected our idea of ourselves, and it's so recent that there's a lot of archive material that we can kind of easily access, and it's still in living memory, people we can talk to.
So thanks so much to Cormac Murray for joining me to talk about that really interesting book, America at Home, The Architecture and Politics of the US Embassy in Dublin. And you'll never look at it the same the next time you're going by it in Ballsbridge. Thank you so much for tuning in to this edition of the podcast. This episode, like all episodes, was sponsored by the listeners of the podcast themselves on Patreon. I hope you enjoyed it. I'll be back very soon.